I assume they're all kind of drunk on the incredible power of having the American military at your beck and call, and are totally carried away with it. And I do think it's a bit politically stupid, and I think we'll see that in the midterms.
Well, let's start with Donald Trump. This is how he responded overnight to questions about how the war is going and when it could end.
We're going to have a much safer world as soon as it's finished, and it's going to be finished pretty quickly. But everybody said the same thing: make sure you win. We will. We've already won in many ways, but we haven't won enough. No, I don't want to brag, but they've said this about a lot of things. No other president can do some of this I'm doing.
Trump can be funny. His speeches can sometimes be entertaining. I think people sort of downplay that a little bit because when they hate what he has to say. But when pretty much everyone in the world's livelihoods are affected, when people are dying in the Middle East, some clarity in leadership perhaps would be useful. The Times has also got an article listing some of the bombastic language that have come out from him and from his team since the start of the war. Here are a few examples of that.
This was never meant to be a fair fight. And it is not a fair fight. We are punching them while they're down, which is exactly how it should be.
They're being decimated now. At some point, I don't think there'll be anybody left maybe to say we surrender, but they're being decimated.
They are toast, and they know it. Or at least, soon enough, they will know it. America is winning, decisively, devastatingly, and without mercy.
That was Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War, and Donald Trump himself speaking over the last 10 days. James, language like this, who's it for? Are they saying this to frighten the Iranians? Are they saying this because they think it impresses their base? Or are they saying it because they like looking at themselves in the mirror when they do so?
I think very firmly the latter. I think it's interesting. We're very used to the kind of nutty, bombastic, self-aggrandizing language from Trump and his lieutenants. I loved when Trump said, I don't want to brag. It's like, no, we know that you do. It's fine. We're over that now. I think it's interesting because a lot of Trump's bombastic language is obviously part of his appeal to his base. And when he's talking about the economy and how it's going to be a roaring economy, I think we suspect a lot of this isn't true. But I think if you are a Trump voter, that's what you want to hear. And it's quite nice to hear a politician, for a lot of people, speaking so braggadociously and forthrightly. Suddenly, when you're talking about a foreign war, which American voters are overwhelmingly opposed to, we know from polling they all hate the war, or not all of them, but there's strong opposition to the war in Iran. To talk about it in such strong, aggrandizing terms, I think will be I think we know from the polling it's going to be a real turn-off for Trump's base, or a lot of Trump's base. It's drawing attention to something that's not popular. It's like it's the kind of equivalent of Keir Starmer constantly going on about the cost of living crisis, and that's not something he's winning on. It's like, why are you talking about it so much? Stop drawing attention to it. But obviously, I assume they're all kind of drunk on the incredible power of having the American military at your beck and call, and are totally carried away with it. And I do think it's a bit politically stupid, and I think we'll see that in the midterms.
It just looks so bad. I mean, so, Charlotte, there's this sort of old American tradition of the strong silent type. Your John Wayne, your Clint Eastwood, and so on. I know you recently rewatched The Sopranos, which I know Tony Soprano is obsessed with whether he should be the strong silent type or not. This is not strong and silent. This is something else. It just looks, I don't know, it looks cheap. It looks beta.
It does, what I mean? In a way. Here's a slightly left field opinion for you. The language we use around war can often be incredibly sanitized. You talk about collateral damage when what you mean is hitting schools, hitting hospitals by accident. And that was a big criticism of the Iraq war and the way that politicians spoke about the Iraq war. War is not sanitized. War is not pleasant. War does involve marching into people's countries and fundamentally seeking their destruction. And Donald Trump and his administration are actually talking about war as what it is. Obviously, they are talking about it from a sort of braggadocious, self-aggrandizing perspective, but it is much more evocative of what it is they are actually trying to do than anything George Bush ever really said.
But they're talking about it as what it is, but also saying, and this is super, most of the time, which is just, maybe there's something very, maybe I'm just being very, Charlotte's right, James, I'm just being very squeamish here.
No, I kind of think what they're talking about in a way isn't really war. It's this kind of cinematic, social mediaized, clipped up version of war that I think seems much more close to like a Marvel superhero film to Donald Trump than it does to anything happening in reality. If you look at all these mental videos that the White House is putting out of all these clips interspersing American fighter jets with bits of superhero films, I think this is what they're talking about. And in a way, that is a kind of sanitized version of war. They're seeing a version of war which is cinematic bombs and explosions and chaos, and they find that very fun to talk about. But actually, I'm not sure that is particularly close to the reality of war, which is like kids being killed and, you know, people's lives and countries being like horrifically disrupted.
James, there aren't many of my columnists that I would ask this question to, but did you ever read The Iraq War Didn't Happen by the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard?
I didn't, I'm afraid to say, but it sounds like you have.
I've read about it. That's good enough. Good enough for a chat, because he basically writes about it's basically about the media coverage during the, I forget which Iraq war it was. I think it was either the first or the second one. I can't remember which one. I think it's the first one actually. And he talks about how the coverage, the sort of excitable footage of, you know, perfectly targeted missiles hitting stuff just removed us so far from the reality of what was happening that the reality might as well have not happened. You know, that it just the public image of it just had nothing to do with what we were seeing at all. And I guess it's a bit like that. It's gung ho. It's wonderful. It's heroic, and it distracts your minds away from, you know, sort of, we had bombs falling on schools and streets on fire. What do you think the American public makes of this language, Charlotte? Because they don't necessarily want to be reminded that the war is real and visceral and nasty, do they?
No, and the polling for this war is incredibly bad, both in the US and in the UK. And one of the big things that Donald Trump got himself elected on was this idea of, you know, America first, no more foreign wars, no more regime change, certainly no more boots on the ground. He's sort of got most of that he's gone back on now. There are no boots on the ground, but this is something that was so core to who he was, and we've just seen a complete about face in what he's doing. And the question I suppose is why? And I sort of wonder whether part of it is that he's in his second term now, and he is entering the sort of, what do they call it? The I was going to say damp squib phase, but it's not. It's the phase where the president lame duck. Yeah, close enough. It's some sort of water animal, and what can you do as a president in that? Or how can you secure some sort of legacy? Well, the one thing you do have complete control over is foreign policy and is foreign intervention. So I wonder if there's something of that to it. There is this fascinating thing he said. I think it was either the Israel-Gaza peace process or the Russia-Ukraine peace process, where he had this fantastic quote where he said something like, "I'm looking to get into heaven, and from what I've heard, I'm not at the front of the queue." And again, he's got a lovely way with words, this guy, when he wants to. And I just thought, wow, this is a man who is looking for his place in history. And then obviously he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wrote to, was it the Prime Minister of Sweden, saying, well, since you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I have no interest in pursuing peace anymore. So, you know, maybe he's decided the history books have something else in store for him. It is quite fascinating. It's psychologically, I mean, this is a point that we could have been making in 2016, and many people were. It's not exactly new, but it's worth reiterating. We just don't see people like this either on the world stage or in life in general.
Speaking of damp squibs, can either of you tell me what a squib is and why it's bad if one's damp?
Oh,
I can tell you.
Can I guess?
Go on.
Is it like a firework?
It is like a firework. Yeah, it's a firework, and so if it gets damp, it doesn't work.
Does that mean I'm one step closer to number 10?
Basically, if you have a damp squib, it's the exact opposite of being hoist on your own petard, I suppose. We'll come back to that. Let's stick with the war for a little bit, because the uncertainty caused by it has put more pressure on the government to act on the cost of living. Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have accepted that inflation is likely to remain higher than the Bank of England's target, and that the longer the war drags on, the worse off people are going to be. The Chancellor has resisted calls to cancel a rise in fuel duty to help people facing higher prices at the pumps. Meanwhile, keen to help, Reform UK's Robert Jenrick and Nigel Farage have been speaking about this today.
We're going to put as much pressure as we possibly can on her to U-turn, and for this to be the 18th.
Well, they're quite good at U-turning, aren't they? So you never know.
And if she doesn't do it, we're being very clear that if there's a Reform government, our first budget will bring down the cost of fuel by taking at least 5p off the cost of fuel every time you fill up.
James, there's a real paradox here, because Keir Starmer's he's been desperate to talk about the cutting the cost of living all year, as is Rachel Reeves. There is a way they could do it now, and yet they don't want to do it because it runs counter to their other projects.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm not sure that cutting the cost of living has been the best thing for Keir Starmer to be banging on about as much as he has all year. Unfortunately, I think a lot of this stuff is now should probably be priced into most government plans. The world is unbelievably unpredictable. All your plans to try and get a handle on the economy are just at the mercy of whatever Donald Trump does next. And the idea that we're in charge, the idea that we can bring the cost of living down without being subject to the global shocks, which now just seem to be kind of complete feature of the world at the moment, seems a bit like wishful thinking to me.
Yeah, well, Charlotte, I say this sort of cards on the table as when it comes to energy, bit of a Milibandite. In the future he wants of, cheap, abundant, renewable energy through endless sort of wind farms and solar farms dotted around the British Isles. I'm all for that. I think that's politically sort of fantastic. But then you listen to Reform saying, look, what you've got to do is scrap, bring down fuel duty, scrap net zero. And you kind of think maybe there's a similar hubris to what Ed Miliband wants to do with energy than when people say, we should be involved in this war in the Middle East, in that this is how a richer, more capable country behaves. We're simply not one. We can't afford to have these ambitions for the world that we enact through our energy policy, just as we can't afford to be involved in big wars.
Can certainly see the case for that, and I suppose the counterpoint to that, or the thing that comes alongside it, is the fact that we are quite a small country. So even if we are incredibly righteous about net zero, we're not going to be making a massive move on the dial on the world stage when it comes to comparisons with huge places like China or India, and we don't have the diplomatic heft to persuade everyone else that what we're doing is a great idea and they should be doing it too. So that's certainly one element of it. I think as well, we as a country just haven't planned well enough to be able to do something like Ed Miliband's plans efficiently. Think about, for example, the famous one is always Nick Clegg in, I think, sort of 2012 or so, saying, well, there's no point in us building more nuclear power stations because they wouldn't be ready until the mid-2020s.
Yes. So thanks.
Yeah, great. Now we're sort of desperately clinging on to a couple of wind farms. We're having to reverse various different green policies because the world is so unstable when it comes to energy. And it just feels like we're a bit impotent, to be honest.
We discussed this a bit. I discussed this a bit yesterday with my columnist James. But do you have a degree of sympathy for Keir Starmer that everything just gets thrown at him? Everything goes wrong. I know things always go wrong. Boris Johnson had a pandemic to deal with when he had other plans. Life is what happens when you're making other plans, as John Lennon sang. But nonetheless, do you have a bit of sympathy for Keir Starmer that just when it looks like he might be beginning to sort of, if not, bring the economy right back onto an even keel, at least improve it, something like this comes along? Yeah,
what it is, events, dear boy, events is what Harold Macmillan or somebody said.
Yes.
I do have sympathy. I think, to be honest, we're moving into a new age of politics where becoming Prime Minister of a country like Great Britain will be much less about imposing your will on the world and your will in the economy and your will on politics, and much more, are you somebody who can steady the ship in a country that no longer matters as much, is much more at the mercy of wider global events. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to see the role of Prime Minister being much more, can you keep a handle on a small dinghy out in a turbulent world, rather than can you enforce your vision in the country and make everything go the way you can. Because I just think the kinds of politics, to preview Charlotte's very good column, that we were accustomed to in the early 2000s, where we had plain sailing and you could put your hand on the tiller and make the economy go a little bit where you wanted it to. I just don't think that exists anymore. And I think a lot of what the sort of political turbulence we're experiencing at the moment is the kind of fury at the impotence of our governments. But unfortunately, we're discovering we're irrelevant in a stormy world. And this is going to, Nigel Farage, if he ever gets into power, will suffer the exact same things, and all his plans to drive events in the right direction will be just as at the mercy of events.
Charlotte, make good on that spoiler then. You've been writing about early 2000s nostalgia, the end of globalization, the rise of social media and all that kind of stuff. Who do you think you are, James Marriott? Tell me about the argument in your column.
Yes, well, about Wednesday of last week, I got a message from my boss saying, what have you got column-wise this week? And I said, well, I presume you don't want me to write about the war. And she said, well, actually, thought, gosh, OK, that's a bit mad because we've got all these fantastic foreign correspondents. What on earth do I possibly have to contribute on this? So I sort of thought about it, and I thought about the world that I grew up in, and I thought about how open it was in so many different ways. And I start the column by talking about the fact that when I was at university, people were sort of, I would message people who were lounging by private pools in Tehran and Tel Aviv, and people were learning Russian as a sort of status symbol because the nightlife in Moscow was so good. And, there were signs that things were going wrong. Russia invaded the Donbass in my second year of university. I think that was 2014 off the top of my head. And yet everything felt like it was only going in one direction. It was becoming more open, and things were so cheap, and we had access to all these fantastic things, all these cheap holidays. I actually remember having a conversation with you a couple of years ago, Hugo, where you said that while your life had been much easier than mine in many ways because, the housing market was better, salaries were higher relative to it, and all the kind of big markers in life, your generation have had a much better time of it. When you were in your early 20s, you described it as it was all a bit off licenses and packs of crisps, and you didn't have this sort of incredible access to cheap holidays and, cheap Deliveroo and this amazing range of consumer goods.
No, I mean, that's true. I mean, we could afford to go to pubs, unlike you people. But yes, I mean, there wasn't the same... there wasn't. There were fewer TV channels.
Yes.
There weren't any iPhones.
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. There certainly wasn't Deliveroo. There wasn't Netflix. There weren't dating apps. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. It's sort of this incredible world of plenty that we lived in. And the point that I make in the column is not only that world has now gone, but the world which we enjoyed in the noughties and the 90s for the first half of the 2010s has sort of created the shocks and the instability we see now. The only way we got those cheap goods and that kind of incredible interconnected world was through this mad system of supply chains, which just means that a butterfly flaps its wings in Japan and suddenly, we have no mustard in the UK. That actually happened with Canada a while ago. There was some sort of strike in Canada and it turns out we get all our French mustard from there, so you can get it for months. At the start of the pandemic, Italy make most of our bottled water and they stopped exporting, so we didn't have bottled water. At the start of the pandemic, in Ukraine, fertilizer, that's huge. Bread, wheat for bread, that's absolutely massive. And things that you would never even have thought about get disrupted, and we really don't have much of a choice if we want to maintain this standard of living, which I think we all do. You can't suddenly turn back in yourself and say, okay, we'll only trade with Ireland and France then, because everything will get more expensive and less plentiful. But we do now just live in this very strange world as a result of it.
I mean, without wanting to get too sort of too thinky about it, James, it's a bit like the way no one owns any stuff anymore. People rent all their stuff. You rent your music. You rent your movies. I'm sure you own bookshelves, but people get them on their Kindles. Everything is dependent upon, as Charlotte says, this huge interconnectedness of this huge sort of backbone of tech and trade. And as soon as that stops working, you're a bit bereft.
Yeah, and I think we're all a bit used to a world that works very easily for us, and we forget how fragile it is. I thought Charlotte's column was great, and I had a similar thought, actually. A couple of years ago, I went to Uzbekistan, just a long-standing ambition of mine, because I know a few people who've been, and I didn't really travel. I was too disorganized as a student to ever go anywhere exciting. And it was at the time that Israel and Iran had begun exchanging missile fire, and our flight to Uzbekistan went over. I think we had to. I can't remember if we did go through Iranian airspace and Russian airspace, but it was through a very sort of odd corridor of the world. And I sort of thought, I'm behaving as if politics doesn't exist. In the early 2000s, quite normal. People did go to Central Asia, and yet this I was sort of behaving in a way that was just belonged to a world that is fading. And we know all these people who are stranded because they can't get through the airports in Dubai, and we've all been continuing to try and behave as if this open, interconnected world that we could all navigate easily, and borders didn't matter and politics didn't matter, and you can go wherever you like, and everywhere in the world a tourist destination is suddenly beginning to close down a bit. It reminds me a lot of one of my favourite books, a brilliant book by Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, which is a memoir of Europe before the outbreak of the First World War, which was still a very open, free, liberal situation, which is kind of similar to the world that we knew in the 90s. And he talks about traveling around Europe, and you didn't need a passport to get in and out of countries. You go and hang out in a cafe in Paris, then you can go to Berlin, and suddenly the First World War breaks out, and Europe is precipitated into a world of borders and geography and politics, and all this stuff matters. And suddenly Stefan Zweig, who's a young student, writer, poet, finds that he's completely stranded, and he ends up, he's on holiday, I think, in France when the war breaks out. He suddenly realizes, oh my God, Austria and France are at war. How on earth am I going to get home? I've been behaving as if politics doesn't exist, as if geography doesn't exist, and I've got to get back home. And it reminds me so much of that we're all trying to live in a world where this doesn't matter, and now it's rushing back for us.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. I'm occasionally aware. I tell people, I've been to Russia quite a few times. When I tell people I've been to Russia, it feels a bit like it did, sort of 10 years ago when you told someone you'd been to Tehran. You know what I mean? It's like it's sort of very much on the other side of whatever.
I had merry plans to go to St. Petersburg before the Ukraine war that will probably never be fulfilled.
It's a beautiful place. It's like Paris, but better. I'll show you some photos.